How did families prepare for winter in the Wild West? These methods still shock historians today. The light was changing over the prairies and forests of the American frontier. The days were getting shorter, the morning air was getting crisper, and the shadows from the tall pines were lengthening, covering the ground with coolness long before sunset. For a settler family living in a log cabin dozens of miles from the nearest fort, these were not just signs of autumn. It was a signal for the start of a long, months-long race in which the price of a mistake was life itself. Survival in winter on the frontier was not decided in snowstorms. It was decided on the warm, clear days of late summer and autumn. Every tree trunk cut down, every ear of corn gathered, every crack sealed in the wall was a contribution to the bank of survival. It was not a panic-stricken rush, but a methodical ritual, honed over generations of preparing for the siege that nature laid on every year. They were not just preparing for the cold. They were preparing for isolation, for silence, for weeks when the only world they knew was the four walls of their home. It was a battle of engineering, foresight, and colossal labor. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how one seemingly insignificant miscalculation in preparation could have cost the family everything they had. What if I told you that everything you know about surviving winter is based on modern conveniences? For a 19th century settler, winter was not just a season, it was a state of being that completely changed the rules of existence. Preparation for it did not begin with the first snow or even the first frost. It began when summer reached its peak, usually in August. The psychology of survival on the frontier was tied to this anticipation. It was a life of constantly watching the horizon and the calendar. Each family kept its own unwritten schedule based on experience and signs. They knew how much time they had left by the color of the leaves on the aspens or by how early in the morning the dew fell. This mental calendar dictated everything. It turned warm, pleasant days into the most stressful time of the year. There was no time for rest or relaxation. Any fine day wasted was seen as a direct step towards future hardship. This created a special psychological tension. Unlike modern people who see winter as more of an inconvenience, settlers saw it as an existential enemy. It was not a force that could be defeated, but one that could only be endured. And the only way to endure it was to be 100% prepared. This meant that from the end of summer, the whole family's life was devoted to one goal: stockpiling. Stockpiling food, fuel, and heat. Each family member had their own tasks that couldn't be put off until tomorrow. Tomorrow it might rain, and the day after tomorrow it might freeze, destroying what was left of the harvest. Work began at dawn and ended at sunset. The pace was not frantic but marathon-like, measured but steady. They knew they had about 100 days to secure 200 days of life. The math was simple and relentless. They saw the days dwindling, and that spurred them on better than any overseer. Each shortening evening was a reminder that the window of opportunity was closing. This race against light and heat was the main psychological feature of life on the frontier. That is why, when we talk about preparing for winter, we are talking not so much about a set of techniques as about a way of thinking. It was a philosophy of total foresight, where there was no room for maybe or later. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. Do you think modern people could psychologically withstand such a months-long race with nature? Write about it in the comments. I will reveal to you a secret that was more important than gold on the frontier. It was not a gun, a bullet, or a horse, but a bag of dried beans and a bundle of corn cobs. These simple things were the very essence of life itself. On the frontier, it wasn't the strongest who survived, but those who knew how to grow, dry, and store food. Gold did not save people from hunger, but beans did. The basis of everything was what a person was able to grow on their own piece of land, cleared of stones, stumps, and roots. The first step after the harvest was to gather every grain, not to lose a single crumb, and then to save everything until spring. Corn was the queen of the fields. It was planted first and harvested last. The cobs were not picked when green, but only when they were completely dry on the stalk and the husks rustled when touched. Then the grains rattled inside like tiny pebbles, a sign of readiness. The harvest was done by hand, often by entire families. It was endless work, day after day, row after row. By evening, their hands burned from the dry fibers, and their clothes smelled of the sweet dust of corn leaves. After harvesting, the second shift began: cleaning. In the evenings, families would sit at the doorstep or by the hearth, and the sound would spread throughout the room. The crackling of husks, the rustling of dry leaves, the soft tapping of cobs against wooden buckets. It took a long time to strip the leaves, but this was what saved the grain from rotting. The cleaned cobs were stacked in rows, sometimes sorted immediately. Small ones for feed, large ones for flour. Everyone knew their place in this process, and no one was in a hurry. When the cleaning was finished, the corn was tied into tight bundles and hung under awnings, in attics or directly above the hearth, where warm smoke slowly drew out the moisture. In the huts, they hung from the ceiling like golden garlands, shimmering in the twilight. The air became sweet with the smell of dried grain. Only completely dried cobs could survive the winter without mold. This supply was literally life insurance. A few sacks determined the fate of the family. Later, the grain was husked, threshed by hand or with simple millstones. Corn flour was used to make porridge, flatbread, and soups, added to dough or eaten with beans. One cob yielded only a few spoonfuls of flour, but those spoonfuls meant warmth, strength, and a morning without hunger. Therefore, corn was treated with respect, almost as a sacred object. Beans and kidney beans were the second bastion of survival. They were left on the stems until they were completely dry. When the pods became brittle, the plants were cut down and carried to compacted ground or spread out tarpaulins. There the threshing began. The dry pods were beaten with sticks, and sometimes pitchforks. The air was filled with ringing and crackling, and the husks flew up in a dusty cloud. After that, the grain was winnowed, tossed on a shovel so that the wind would carry away everything light. It was almost a musical action. Each gust of wind decided how much food would remain in the bag. The cleaned beans were dried again, in the sun or by the hearth, until they began to rattle when shaken. Then they were poured into canvas bags, tied with strong string, and hidden in the shade. These bags were like little chests of energy, concentrated protein, necessary for the long winter. One handful could feed a person, one bag could feed a family. They were guarded like gunpowder, from moisture, from rodents, from prying eyes. Pumpkins and squash occupied a special place. Their thick skin was a natural armor against time. They were not dried, salted, or hidden in pits. The main thing was not to damage the skin or break the stem. They had to be picked carefully, almost like eggs. Pumpkins were stored in a cool, dry place, placed on straw so that they did not touch each other. With proper care, such fruits could be stored until spring, and each pumpkin was a reserve of water, sugar, and light. Root vegetables required a different approach. Potatoes, turnips, carrots. None of them tolerated frost and could not be stored in the open air. They could not simply be piled up in a corner. The settlers knew that if the ground froze, all their hard work would be wasted. Therefore, a solution emerged that could be called an engineering miracle of an era without engineers. They built special storage facilities, underground pits lined with logs and turf, where the temperature remained above zero even in January. These were their earth refrigerators, which we will discuss in the next chapter. But before we go down there, it is important to understand one thing. All this work, harvesting, threshing, airing, sorting, was not just a craft, but a rhythm of survival. People knew that it was not weapons that saved them, but order, not strength, but attention. One poorly dried sack could rot and destroy months of labor. One forgotten crack in the roof could let in moisture, and the entire pantry would be ruined. Therefore, the harvest was treated as if it were alive. It was listened to, checked, touched, and cherished. Which of these methods seems the most labor-intensive to you? Where does physical work end and the art of survival begin? But remember, harvesting was only half the battle. The real test awaited underground. Are you ready to learn how the settlers built underground fortresses where grain slept under a layer of earth and the cold had no power? What I am about to show you was the heart of any farmhouse, even more important than the bedroom. It was the root cellar, a structure that seems primitive today, was actually a finely tuned instrument that used the physics of the Earth itself to preserve life. The choice of location was critical. The ideal option was to dig the cellar into a hillside so that the entrance was horizontal. This made it easier to load and unload supplies. If the terrain was flat, a deep pit was dug, and the entrance was made in the form of a sloping hatch with sturdy steps. The walls were a work of art. In rocky areas, they were laid out of dry stone, without mortar. The stones were fitted so tightly that the structure held itself together and breathed at the same time. In wooded areas, the walls were covered with thick, tarred logs to prevent the earth from crumbling. The floor was always earthen. This was not a sign of poverty, but a key technology. It was the damp, compacted earth that allowed the cellar to maintain the high humidity necessary to prevent root crops from drying out and wilting. The roof was no less important. It was made of thick logs on which a layer of grass or bark was laid, and a thick layer of earth, sometimes up to half a meter, was poured on top. This earthen mass served as an ideal insulator, smoothing out temperature fluctuations. The most ingenious element was the ventilation. Without a supply of fresh air, vegetables began to suffocate and quickly spoil. Therefore, the cellar design always included two ventilation channels, one low at the entrance for cold air to flow in, and one high at the far end, often in the form of a pipe leading to the surface, for warm air to flow out. Inside, the cellar was equipped with shelves and bins. Potatoes and turnips were stored in large compartments directly on the floor. Carrots and beets were often sprinkled with layers of damp sand in boxes. This kept them fresh, as if they had just been dug up. Jars of canned food were placed on the shelves if the family had the opportunity. Pumpkins and squash were arranged so that they did not touch each other. The cellar maintained an almost constant temperature, just above freezing. The smell in the root cellar was unique, a mixture of damp earth, ozone, and the sweet aroma of stored vegetables. It was the smell of security. The family knew that as long as the cellar was full, they would survive the winter. This underground safe was more important than the house itself. The house could freeze, but if the cellar was full, the family had the calories to produce heat. It was their real fortress against hunger. Guess what was the settler's main enemy inside his own home? It was not the cold, the frost, or the wind itself, but its invisible agent, the draft. It was more cunning than any enemy outside. The draft did not make noise or break doors, but slowly drew heat from the room like an invisible hand. It was with them that the main internal war on the frontier was fought, a war to retain the heat obtained with sweat and firewood. A log cabin, no matter how sturdy it was, always had cracks. The wood breathed, dried out, cracked, and cold air entered through these gaps. Every autumn, the same operation began. Insulation, or, as they said then, chinking and daubing, filling and plastering the walls. It was hard, dirty, but vitally necessary work. It determined how much of the heat produced by the hearth would remain inside and how much would escape outside with the smoke. It was impossible to wait for winter. Those who delayed would later shiver. First, they started with chinking, filling the large gaps between the logs. These gaps were inevitable. Fresh wood dried out, shrunk, and dark gaps appeared between the crowns. Air flowed freely through them, and the flames in the hearth lost their meaning. Therefore, the gaps were filled with whatever was at hand. Dry moss, tow, wood chips, sawdust, old rags, shreds of wool, and twisted straw were used. Sometimes they even added pieces of old blankets or oiled cloth. Anything that could trap air was considered material. They worked silently and intently. The men stood outside with knives and hatchets, while the women and children handed them materials and checked from the inside to see if the gap was still visible. The blows of the knife and the knock of the wooden mallet created a special rhythm, the sound of preparation for winter. The gap had to be not just closed, but tightly caulked, tamped down to the last splinter. Sometimes clay or resin was placed between the layers to strengthen the base. This bottom layer served not as insulation, but as a foundation for the next barrier. When the entire house was caulked, the next stage began, daubing or plastering. This was real construction work. For daubing, a thick, viscous solution was prepared, something between plaster and earth. The recipe depended on local conditions, but most often clay, sand, water, and a binding agent were used. Chopped straw, hay, moss, and sometimes ash or even manure served as the binding agent. All this was mixed with shovels in a large tub until the mass became as thick as dough. The entire process was physical labor. People kneaded the clay with their bare feet to make it pliable. Their fingers stuck together and their hands froze, but no one complained. Then they took handfuls of this mixture and rubbed it into the cracks on top of the chinking with their fingers, palms, and wooden spatulas. The clay had to be pressed in deeply until it formed a continuous layer. Each section of the walls was done twice, from the outside and from the inside. The work had to be done quickly. If the clay began to dry out, it lost its adhesion and everything had to be started over again. Special attention was paid to corners, window openings, and door frames. These were the places where the draft was strongest. Sometimes we returned to these places several times, adding a new layer until even the slightest hint of air movement disappeared. After drying, the daubing became as hard as fired brick and formed a dense crust on the logs. The house, which had whistled in the wind just yesterday, now sounded dull and calm, as if it had become a warm animal, holding its breath until spring. But the work did not end there. Daubing required maintenance. Over the course of a year, rain washed away the clay, the sun dried it out, and the wood moved, opening new cracks. Therefore, every autumn, the process had to be repeated. Sometimes the old plaster was knocked off and reapplied. It was a never-ending battle between man and his own home. The house was alive, and it had to be looked after like livestock. Skip a week, and the cold would find its way back in. In winter, when the wind carried snow along the walls, the settlers could hear it searching for weak spots. Where the plaster was loose, a thin whistle would appear, the first sign of heat loss. Then they would get up, even at night, take clay from a bucket by the hearth, and patch the hole before it froze. So the house lived with the people, reacted, breathed, resisted. The insulation work took days, sometimes weeks. It was not just preparation, but a test of family unity. Someone kneaded, someone handed, someone watched over the drying. After the daubing, the house smelled of earth, smoke, and straw, the smell of readiness. Have you ever thought about how much patience the simple word insulate required? One house could require hundreds of buckets of clay and thousands of hand movements. But without this procedure, all the efforts to prepare firewood and food would have been in vain. A house without heat is just a trap for the wind. But even airtight walls were worthless without fire. In the next chapter, you will learn about the real fuel marathon that lasted all summer, how the settlers gathered firewood, stockpiled coal, and why one wrong fire could result in the loss of an entire season. The hearth or stove was the heart of the hut, not metaphorically, but literally. Life depended on their heat. Without them, the house turned into a cold box where breath turned into steam and froze on the walls. In the harsh winter, the fire burned around the clock, and the flames could not be left unattended even for an hour. If the heat died down, the cold did not simply return. It burst into the house like a living creature, creeping across the floor, getting into clothes, blankets, and bones. Keeping the fire burning meant keeping your breath. But to keep this fire burning, a truly enormous amount of fuel was required. Firewood was not just a material, it was currency, a measure of prosperity. It was prepared from spring until almost the first frost. Every day when it did not rain was considered a working day. Autumn harvesting was already the finish line. Those who started late were late for winter. It has been calculated that the average family on the frontier burned between 15 and 30 cords of firewood in one winter. One cord is almost 3.5 cubic meters of tightly packed logs. Now imagine, 30 cords is an entire forest converted into heat. It only seems that wood burns easily. In reality, each log represents days of labor, the sound of an axe, and the smell of resin. The work began with felling trees. The tools were simple: an axe, or less often, a two-handed saw, if you were lucky enough to get one. Alone or in pairs, you had to fell dozens of trees, not for fun, but for survival. The axe sang slowly and monotonously. With each blow, cold metal trembled in the palms, and sweat mixed with wood dust stuck to the neck. When the tree finally fell, Its rumble rolled around the area, and for a moment the air was filled with the smell of fresh bark and resin, the smell of future warmth. The species were chosen wisely. Oak, hickory, maple. Heavy, dense, with even burning. They provided long, steady heat. Pine or spruce were left for kindling. They burned quickly and loudly, leaving a lot of soot. Soft wood was only good for an instant fire, but not for the night. The wrong choice could cost you sleep. And sometimes your life. A smoky hut is almost as cold as a cold one. After felling came cross-cutting, sawing or chopping the trunks into pieces suitable for the hearth. It was hour after hour of monotonous work requiring tremendous endurance. The trunks had to be rolled, lifted, cleared, and chopped. Every blow reverberated in the shoulders. Every splinter flew into the face. But without this, it was impossible to move on to the next stage. When the logs were cut, they began to chop them. It was a special ritual of strength and rhythm. The log was placed on a block, a swing, a blow, and a crunch, as if dry ice was breaking. If the wood fell evenly, it meant that the axe was positioned correctly. By the end of the day, their hands were sore, but their eyes shone with confidence. The mountain of logs was already a piece of the coming winter. But all this would be in vain without drying. Wet wood burned poorly, gave off little heat, and choked with smoke. Therefore, fresh logs were not thrown into a pile, but stacked in wood piles, entire architectural structures made of wood for wood. A properly built woodpile was a source of pride. It was built against the wall of the house, where the sun shone longer and the wind blew freely. Sometimes logs or stones were placed under the logs to allow air to pass underneath. Drying took months. At first, the logs darkened, cracked, and resin appeared on them. Then they became light and ringing. An experienced person could determine their readiness by the sound. If you hit two logs together, wet ones moan dully, dry ones sing. By the end of autumn, the woodpile turned into a wall of fire frozen in wood. Sometimes it was taller than a person and stretched along the entire length of the hut. Passers-by could assess the house by its appearance. A neat, even woodpile meant that everything was in order. It was warm, and the family was ready. A broken, crooked, sparse woodpile meant trouble and a cold future. A good woodpile smelled like summer. Wood dust, resin, dry air. In the frost, it sounded special, as if it were breathing. Each log stored the energy of the sun, gathered by the wind, rain, and human hands. When it was thrown into the hearth, the flames returned that energy, turning labor into warmth. But gathering firewood was not a one-time thing. It was a constant cycle, a test of character. From spring to autumn, felling, chopping, drying, stacking, then winter, using it, cleaning the chimney, checking the supply. In the spring, it all started again. It was a fuel calendar that ruled the life of the family. Without this wall of firewood, no food or clothing could save you. A cellar full of supplies was useless without heat. Only warmth gave meaning to everything else. The woodpile became not just a supply, but a symbol of the boundary between man and wild nature. Behind the wall was life. Beyond it was wind, ice, and night. What if I told you that the simplest resource we take for granted turned into a daily struggle in winter? Water was needed constantly for drinking, cooking, and basic hygiene. But what do you do when the nearest stream freezes to the bottom and buckets cover with ice in minutes? The ideal solution was a well dug next to the house. It provided access to groundwater that did not freeze. However, digging a well by hand was a titanic task, and not all settlers had one. Those who did have a well faced another problem: the freezing of the lifting mechanism. If it was a log cabin with a winch, it had to be constantly cleared of ice. If it was a later hand pump, it could simply freeze and rupture the cast iron body. Therefore, the pumps were often wrapped in burlap and straw, creating a warm cocoon around them. In severe frosts, it was even necessary to pour hot water over the mechanism just to get it moving. Every bucket of water was the result of a small battle with the cold. If there was no well, the only source of water was a stream or river. Every morning began with taking an axe and going to the water. The first thing to do was to cut a hole in the thick layer of ice to get to the living water. This work was dangerous and exhausting. Then you had to scoop up buckets of ice water and carry them back to the house, trying not to spill them. Water that got on your clothes froze instantly, turning them into an icy shell. Inside the house, the water was stored in a large barrel that stood by the stove to keep it from freezing. But this supply had to be replenished daily. It was an endless cycle. Walking to the river, cutting ice, carrying heavy buckets across slippery snow. In snowy winters, there was another source: snow. It would seem to be a simple solution. Snow is everywhere. However, in practice, it was extremely inefficient. Snow is very loose, and to get one bucket of water, you had to melt a huge mountain of snow. This process burned a huge amount of precious firewood. Every pot of snow placed on the fire was a log that could have been used to heat the room. Therefore, snow was only melted in extreme cases or during severe storms when it was impossible to reach the river. Have you ever thought about such a simple problem as frozen water? But when a blizzard was raging outside and physical work was impossible, what did the family do? In the next chapter, we will talk about the quiet but no less important work of repair. Winter, for all its harshness, gave the settlers one valuable resource: time. When the fields were covered with snow and outdoor work was reduced to a minimum, it was time for repairs. This was a period when everything that had broken during the busy summer was repaired and equipment was prepared for the coming spring. The fire in the hearth provided not only warmth, but also enough light for painstaking work. The main focus was on tools: axes, wedges for splitting wood, hoe handles, pitchforks. All of these were subject to intense wear and tear. Winter was the time to make new handles. The settler took pre-cut and dried pieces of hard wood, ash or hickory, and spent hours carving them with a knife, shaping them to the desired form. A smooth, well-balanced handle was the key to efficient and safe work. Then the old cracked handle was removed from the axe, and a new one was put in its place. It was precision work that required fitting and proper wedging so that the blade would sit dead center. The metal parts also required maintenance. The blades of axes, knives, chisels, and saws had to be sharpened. This process was done on a hand-operated whetstone. The monotonous rotation of the wheel and the sound of metal sliding across the abrasive were the usual background noise of a winter evening. Not only work tools were repaired, but also household items: a cracked chair leg, a wobbly table, a broken door latch. All of this was repaired in the warmth of the hut. Simple carpentry tools, glue made from bone remains, and wooden pins were used. Much attention was paid to repairing wooden barrels and tubs. Over the summer, they could dry out and their hoops would weaken. Barrels were critical for storing water, pickles, and flour. They were taken apart, cleaned, and tightly hooped again. Harnesses and leather goods were also repaired. Sturdy canvas bags and covers for carts were also repaired. Any tears or wear were carefully sewn up with thick waxed thread using a large awl. This winter work was an investment in the future. When spring came and the new cycle of field work began, there would be no time for repairs. Every tool in good working order saved precious days in the spring. The long winter evenings were a time not only for repairs, but also for production. When the wind whistled and the ice cracked outside the walls of the hut, life inside did not stand still. People did not sit idle. Inaction was considered an unaffordable luxury. The evening was not a time for rest, but a quiet change of work. During the day, they worked with axes and shovels, and at night, with needles, knives, and their fingers. The fire provided light, and this light had to be used until the last ember burned out. All the adults gathered around the hearth. The men sharpened knives, straightened axe blades with a ruler, and repaired tool handles. The women darned, carved, and sewed, while the children handed them thread and held the fabric. The house was filled with the steady rustling of thread, the squeak of a knife on wood, and the quiet crackling of the fire. It was the evening sound of survival, the music of craftsmanship without words or complaints. The main task was to maintain clothing. Coarse canvas and thick cloth could not withstand long periods of work in the wind and damp. A shirt could be torn by a knot. Pants could be worn out by a saddle or shovel. Any hole was not just untidiness, it was a loss of warmth. Therefore, darning was almost a sacred task. Each stitch restored protection to the body. Materials were scarce. New fabric was expensive, and the city was far away. Therefore, old things were never thrown away. Worn-out shirts were turned into patches, scraps of cloth into thread, and scraps of canvas into rags. Everything was sorted by size and stored neatly so that it could be found later. Sometimes even the threads were washed off unraveled items so that they could be used again. Hands accustomed to the axe learned the subtleties of the needle in the evenings. In poor lighting, this work was a challenge. Their eyes grew tired, but they still sewed as long as they had the strength. There was not enough light. The lamp smoked, the flame flickered, and shadows moved on the walls. And yet the needle moved, because tomorrow's morning work in the snow depended on it. If the family had rolls of fabric left over from what they had bought in the city in the summer, winter became a time for sewing. They worked without cutting tables, right on their knees or on the floor. Pieces of fabric were laid out by the stove and marked with chalk or charcoal. Every shirt, every pair of trousers required hours of patience. They sewed by hand, with long, even, strong stitches, without machines, without iron needles with eyes if there were none. Sometimes they used bone or a thin twig sharpened with a knife. Light was a constant concern. A kerosene lamp was considered almost a luxury. If there was one in the house, it was cared for like a living creature. Every morning, the glass was wiped clean of soot, and in the evening, the wick was trimmed. A tall wick gave a lot of light but burned fuel quickly. A low wick smoldered, leaving a smell of grease and smoke. And you always had to choose, a little light now or a little warmth later. When the kerosene ran out, they returned to the old ways. A splinter, a tallow candle, smoldering coal in an iron bowl. There was just enough light to see their hands. This made the work slower, but also quieter. Life fell into the rhythm of the fire's breath. In addition to mending clothes, winter evenings were a time for woodworking. Men carved spoons, mugs, bowls, and scoops. They worked with knives and chisels, warming the wood with the heat of their palms. They chose soft wood, linden, birch, pine. Each type of wood had its own smell and its own melody under the blade. The rough blank gradually turned into the desired object, and the house was filled with the smell of fresh shavings. Sometimes these items were exchanged or given as gifts, but more often they were used for everyday purposes. Basket weaving was another winter activity. Willow rods were harvested in advance, in the fall, when the bark was still easy to remove. In winter, when the wood became flexible, the rods were steamed over a fire and weaving began. It was a slow-paced craft. The rhythmic movement of the hands, the soft crackling of the willow, the light smell of smoke and damp wood. Baskets were made in all sizes, for grain, for laundry, for gathering herbs in the spring. Even a child could help by handing out the rods and learning to feel the bend. All this work took place in one room. The house breathed with the people. In one corner they sewed, in another they planed, near the stove they dried the blanks, and closer to the wall stood the baskets. Sometimes the house became crowded, but no one complained. It was a workshop of survival. Everything happened to the sound of crackling wood, the warm breath of the stove, in the dim light where the light touched only hands and fabric. When the flames in the hearth died down, the work was over. The lamp was extinguished, the tools were put away in a box, and the needle was stuck into the edge of the fabric so as not to lose it. A thick silence fell over the house. People went to bed with the feeling that the day had not been wasted. Every stitch, every cut, every woven basket was a link in a chain of warmth, order, and survival. Not everything could be grown, found, or made by hand. There was a list of critically important goods that could only be bought. Once or twice a year, always before the onset of winter, a settler would set off on a long journey to the nearest general store or trading post. It was an expedition that could take several days. Traveling by wagon on bad roads was slow. The family saved up for this trip all year, trading surplus crops or furs for cash or credit. The main item on the shopping list was salt. Salt was a strategic resource. It was needed not only to flavor food, but also for preservation. Without salt, it was impossible to preserve many foods. It was bought in large bags or even barrels. The second item on the list was flour or grain. Even if a family grew their own corn, they often had to buy wheat flour for baking bread. It was purchased in huge canvas sacks weighing 50 or 100 pounds. Sugar, coffee, and tea were luxury items, but people tried to buy at least a small amount of them. During the dark, cold winter months, a hot, sweet drink was not only a source of calories, but also an important psychological comfort. Gunpowder and lead for bullets were absolutely essential. A rifle was a tool for protection, and in some cases, the only way to obtain fresh food. A supply of ammunition was a guarantee of safety. Kerosene for lamps was the only source of bright light. It was purchased in large tin cans. Without it, the family would be plunged into darkness immediately after sunset, making any evening work impossible. They also bought matches, soap, perhaps a roll of fabric, new needles and thread, nails and other metal items that could not be made locally. All these goods were carefully packed and carried home like treasure. Upon their return, these supplies were not simply dumped in a corner. They were given the driest and safest place in the hut. Flour was stored in wooden chests to protect it from moisture. Salt was kept in an airtight barrel. This strategic reserve was a bridge connecting the family to the outside world. It supplemented what the land provided and provided those elements of civilization without which survival would have been much more difficult. And so the moment came when all the main work was done. The cellar was full, the woodpile rose to the roof, the walls of the house no longer breathed with drafts, and the sacks of flour and grain stood in a row like soldiers on duty. Everything that could be grown, cut, sewn, or stacked was completed. A short, almost unreal period of calm was approaching. A quiet transition between autumn and winter, a time for final checks, when every step was no longer hurried, but still cautious. The air was filled with the smell of damp earth, rotten leaves, and smoke. The smell of the approaching end of the season. The first thing they did was tackle the chimney. Over the summer, it had collected everything the wind had brought. Dry leaves, dust, cobwebs. Sometimes birds built nests there, and if they weren't removed, smoke would enter the house in winter. A clogged chimney is not just bad draft, it is a fire hazard. Therefore, every year before the first snow, one of the men would climb onto the roof with a long pole to which a bundle of branches or fir branches was tied with a rope. The knocking, rustling, flying flakes of soot, and smell of burning all meant that the house was ready to breathe again. When a steady stream of smoke came out of the chimney, you could breathe easy. Winter would accept the fire, not consume it. After the chimney, the roof was checked. It took the full brunt of the elements. Rain, hail, snow, and ice. Every board, every shingle mattered. If water found its way inside somewhere, rot would appear in the attic within a week, and by spring there would be a leak that could ruin supplies and bedding. Therefore, the roof underwent a final inspection. In the hoarse wind, a man crawled across the slippery boards, replacing rotten spots, filling cracks with moss or resin. The work was completed in the evening, when the sky was already streaked with low-gray clouds. It was a safety ritual, a last battle with time. Then attention turned to the base of the house. The cold crept up from below, from the ground. To keep it out, an extra layer of earth, sometimes mixed with straw, was piled around the foundation. This is how the Zyvalinka was born. A simple but ingenious solution. It was tamped down with feet, closing the gaps between the logs and the ground. Some people laid a layer of turf on top or put up a wooden shield to prevent the wind from blowing the earth away. This work was not difficult, but it was of great importance. The Zyvalinka retained heat like a collar around the neck. Next came the windows and shutters. Many houses had sturdy shutters made of boards fastened with iron hinges. They not only protected from the wind, but also retained heat, turning windows into barriers against icy storms. In the fall, every hinge was checked and lubricated with grease or a piece of tallow to prevent squeaking. At night, the shutters were closed tightly, leaving only a crack for light to shine through. When the wind howled outside, the shutters groaned and shook, but they held fast. And this dull sound meant that the house was alive inside, while winter raged outside. They did not forget about tools. Shovels, saws, axes, hoes. Everything that served in the summer now had to survive the winter. Metal broke in the cold, wood cracked, and rust rendered any tool useless. Therefore, all iron was carefully cleaned, lubricated with grease or ash, wrapped in rags, and stored under a canopy or in a shed. The shed became cramped, but order reigned there almost like in the military. Every item had its place. In the spring, it had to be found exactly as it had been left. Inside the house, too, it was time for change. Life was reduced to one, the warmest room, the one with the hearth. Sleeping places were moved closer to it, away from the walls. Wooden beds or benches were covered with blankets, straw, and fur. The space was reduced, but it became cozier and more organized. Women laid out supplies, flour, groats, dried herbs, in bags and boxes, closer at hand. The children helped stack firewood in the corner, creating an internal fuel supply, a small copy of the huge wood pile outside the wall. Now during a snowstorm, there would be no need to go outside. Shovels, brushes, and brooms for snow were placed by the door. Sometimes there was a bucket of sand to sprinkle on the threshold if it froze over by morning. Everything mattered. In winter, every little thing determined whether you would freeze or not. The door was checked especially carefully. The hinges were lubricated and the edges were sealed with moss to keep the wind out. And finally the day came when the sky changed. The air became still, the sounds muffled and the smell cleaner. And suddenly the first snowflakes began to fall from the gray sky. Sparse, light, as if someone were trying to touch the ground with a white feather. They did not melt. They settled on the frozen ground, on the roof, on the firewood. People went out onto the porch and watched in silence. It was a signal, the end of the season. Everything that needed to be done had already been done. The settlers brought in the last buckets of water, locked the doors, and threw fresh wood on the fire. Silence fell in the house, broken only by the crackling of the logs and the breathing of the family. The race was over. From that day on, life went into waiting mode, waiting for winter, wind, snow, the first tracks in the snowdrifts. Everything else now depended on how well they had prepared. We can see that preparing for winter on the frontier was not just a set of routine tasks. It was a complex, multi-level survival strategy that required engineering skills, a deep understanding of nature, physical endurance, and iron discipline. Every element of this preparation, from the earthen floor in the cellar to the clay plaster on the walls, was the result of centuries of experience, paid for with countless mistakes and losses. The settlers did not fight winter. They learned to coexist with it, respecting its power and anticipating its every move. It was an annual test of their right to live on this land, and failure was not an option. The quiet, methodical work on warm autumn days was a real battle for survival that began long before the first frost. What other topics from the era of frontier exploration would you like us to cover? Perhaps the construction of log cabins themselves, or life in remote trading posts? Suggest topics for future videos in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new episodes.